She set the pot on the table, and no one spoke. That alone was unusual enough. 14 men ate in the bunkhouse every evening, men who argued over cards and debated the merits of one saddle brand over another and talked simply for the pleasure of noise. But when the steam rose from that pot and the smell reached them, onions and slow-cooked broth and something deeper underneath, something that had no right being in a working ranch kitchen, every one of them went quiet. Spoons paused. Chairs stopped scraping. A man at the far end looked up from a hand of cards he had been studying and set it face down on the table without thinking. Nora Calloway stood at the far end of the table with her hands folded in front of her apron and waited. She had not planned to cook for the crew. She had been hired to keep the house in order and to see to the meals for Cale Reston and his daughter. That was the arrangement. 3 weeks' trial, a room off the kitchen, and enough pay to cover what she owed on her sister's doctoring bills back in Abilene. Nothing more. But the ranch cook had thrown his back out that afternoon, and when the foreman came to the door with his hat in his hands and explained the situation, she had simply asked how many men and gone to the kitchen. She had not consulted anyone. She had not asked permission. She had looked at what was in the larder and made her assessment and gotten on with it. She had not told Cale. He found out the same way the rest of them did. Cale Reston had not intended to eat in the bunkhouse. He ate at the house, at the small table in the kitchen, across from his daughter Bea, who was 7 and who spoke sparingly but observed everything. That was their way, had been their way for 3 years, since Eleanor died, and the shape of it had grown familiar enough that Cale had stopped noticing it as grief and had begun to think of it simply as life. But his foreman Dutch had come to him that evening with something like wonder on his weathered face and had said only that Cale ought to come down to the bunkhouse. He had not explained further. A man like Dutch did not use that tone without cause. Cale had left Bea at the house with the lamp lit and walked the long yard to the bunkhouse in the last light of evening, and he had stepped through the door into the silence. 14 men, none of them moving. Bowls being lifted without a sound. Nora Calloway stood at the end of the table. She was not a remarkable-looking woman, or so he had thought when she arrived on the afternoon stage 3 days before. Plain dark hair, plain dark dress, hands that had clearly known work. She carried a single bag and did not ask for help with it. She had looked at the house with the same measuring expression she might have used on a fence line, and then she had come inside and gotten to work without asking where anything was kept. She had found the broom, found the pantry, found the order of things on her own, and by the end of the first day, the house smelled of wood smoke and clean floors, and something almost like intention. He had hired her through a written arrangement. His mother's neighbor in Kansas had recommended her as steady and capable. He had written 3 lines. She had written back 4, asking only about the child's age and whether there was a cat in the house that might bother her at night. There was no cat. She had taken the position. Now she stood in his bunkhouse, hands folded, watching his crew eat in silence, and Cale Reston had the unsettling sense that something had changed on his land without his permission. He took a bowl. He sat down. The broth was clear and deep and tasted of something he could not immediately name. Then he could. It tasted the way his mother's kitchen had smelled in November. That particular warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. He looked up at Nora Calloway and she was already looking somewhere else. He told her the next morning that cooking for the crew was not part of her arrangement. She was at the kitchen table, working through a week's worth of darning that Bea had apparently been collecting in a basket under her bed. She did not look up from the sock in her hands. He told her Dutch's man would be back on his feet in a few days, and she should not take it upon herself to manage the bunkhouse on top of her other duties. She said she understood. He stood in the kitchen doorway a moment longer than necessary, then left. B was in the yard when he came out, crouching in the dust near the fence post where she had been conducting some kind of private study of a beetle for the better part of the week. She glanced up at him, then back at the beetle. She had Eleanor's way of looking at things. Patient, long-focused, as if the thing she was watching held secrets that would eventually reveal themselves to anyone willing to wait. He went to the barn. The first sign was so small that Cale almost missed it. It was the fourth evening, a Thursday. He came in from the north pasture later than he had intended, boots wet from creek mud, and found the kitchen lit and Bea already at the table. Nora was at the stove. There were 3 places set, not 2. 3, Bea had set the table. That much was clear. She always arranged things precisely, the spoons parallel to the bowls, because Eleanor had been the same way, and it was one of those small inheritances a child carries without knowing she is carrying it. But there were 3 places. Nora's usual practice had been to take her own supper after they had finished, at the end of the table alone, quietly, without being asked. That was how things had begun, and neither Cale nor Bea had thought to change it. Bea had changed it. Nora was at the stove and seemed to be making a point of not noticing what Bea had done. She moved the pot, adjusted the flame, and did not turn around. Cale looked at his daughter. Bea picked up her spoon and set it down again, fractionally straighter. He pulled out his chair and sat. Nothing was said about the 3 places. Supper was eaten. The wind pushed at the kitchen window, and the lamp held steady, and Bea talked for a little while about the beetle, which had apparently taken up permanent residence near the fence post, and which she had decided to name Walter. Nora asked with a straight face whether Walter had expressed any preference in the matter. Bea considered this seriously, and concluded that he probably had not minded. Cale ate his supper and did not say anything, but he was aware of the table in a way he had not been in a long time. The weight of 3 people in a kitchen. The way a lamp lit 3 faces instead of 2. He had not felt that particular weight in 3 years. On the 6th morning, he came out of the barn to find Nora standing at the near corner of the eastern fence, looking out along the line. He watched her from a distance. She walked the fence slowly. She crouched at one post and pressed the flat of her hand to it, testing the give in the ground. She moved to the next one and did the same. She had a way of inspecting something that was focused and unhurried, and that reminded him, uncomfortably, of the way his father had used to look over a new piece of land, not as a visitor, but as someone already responsible for it. She did not see him. He went back into the barn. That evening at supper she mentioned without looking up from her plate that the ground under the eastern section was not holding because of the angle of drainage from the hill. The posts would keep working loose until someone redirected the runoff with a shallow ditch before the next freeze. A single man, half a day, and very little cost. Cale looked at her. She cut a piece of bread and set it on the edge of her bowl. He told her he would speak to Dutch about it. Dutch put in the ditch the following day, and the fence stayed solid through the first hard frost and the one after that. Cale did not mention it again, but he began, quietly and without announcement, to notice what else she noticed. The trouble that arrived was not dramatic. That was the nature of trouble on a working ranch. It did not come in the form of armed men or sudden catastrophe. It came in the form of numbers. The banknote on the south section was due at the end of the month, and the calf prices at the fall market had come in lower than any of them had expected. Not ruinous. Not yet. But close enough that Cale sat at the table after Bea went to bed and looked at the same figures for 3 evenings running without them changing. He had not said anything to anyone. He was a man who kept his own counsel, always had been. But Nora saw it. He did not know when. He only knew that on the 4th morning there was an envelope on the kitchen table addressed to him in her handwriting. Inside was a folded page with 2 columns of figures. The first column was what the house had been spending. The second was what it could spend. The difference was real. Flour in larger quantities, lamp oil ordered differently, a half-dozen small adjustments that individually seemed modest and together added up to something that mattered. At the bottom of the page she had written that she did not know his full situation, but that if the figures were of any use, he was welcome to them. He stood at the table for a long time with the page in his hand. It helped. He adjusted the order with the supply merchant the following week, and the difference gave him room to breathe through the end of the month. He did not tell her so. What he did instead was this. When she came into the kitchen the next morning and moved to build the fire, he had already built it. The coffee was made. Her cup was at her place. She stopped in the doorway. He picked up his own cup and went out to the barn. The woman from town arrived on a Thursday afternoon. Her name was Mrs. Aldridge, and she was the kind of woman who moved through a room as though she had designed it and was evaluating the results. She had called on Cale once before, in September, with a pie and what she described as concern for Bee's schooling. Cale had thanked her for the pie and closed the subject. She came now with another pie and a more direct purpose. Cale brought her inside, as courtesy required, and she sat at the kitchen table and spoke about the town's autumn social and the school curriculum and the difficulty of managing a ranch household without a proper arrangement, by which she seemed to mean an arrangement of a permanent, matrimonial nature, which she appeared prepared to discuss at length. Nora was not in the kitchen. She was somewhere in the back of the house, and Cale was aware of her absence in the specific way a man becomes aware of things he has stopped thinking of as temporary. Mrs. Aldridge talked for the better part of an hour. She also remarked, in the course of things, that it was unusual for a man in Cale's position to rely on a hired woman for the running of his household. She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way people say things they believe to be simply true. She said a child needed permanence, a real mother's hand, and that a hired arrangement was a fine enough stopgap but could not substitute for the real thing indefinitely. Cale thanked her for the pie. He did not say anything else. After she left, he stood at the kitchen window and watched the road and thought about the word she had used. Stopgap, as though a person could be a stopgap. As though the 3 evenings of supper with the lamp lit and Bee talking about Walter and the particular weight of a kitchen with 3 people in it amounted to nothing permanent. He went to find Bee and found her on the back porch with Nora. They were sitting on the step, close enough that Bee's shoulder was pressed against Nora's arm. Nora had mending in her hands. Bee was talking in that quiet, continuous way she had sometimes, not quite to Nora and not quite to herself, the way she used to talk to Eleanor when she was very small. He stood at the door. Nora glanced up and saw him and went still. Bee did not notice. She kept talking. He went back inside and put supper on. That evening, after Bee was in bed, he told Nora her arrangement was secure through the end of winter. He set it to the floor, or thereabouts, because he was not a man who looked at people when he was saying the things that mattered. He said it was working out fine. She stood at the counter with a dish towel in her hands, and he could not read her expression. She thanked him. He went to bed. In the morning he came into the kitchen, and Bee was already up, sitting in Nora's chair rather than her own, with Nora's empty coffee cup on the table in front of her. Nora came in from outside with an armload of wood and stopped when she saw the scene. Bee looked up at her and explained, without apology, that she had sat in Nora's chair so that Nora would have to sit beside her at breakfast. Nora set the wood down by the stove. She sat in the chair beside Bee, which was the wrong chair, Bee's chair, which left the arrangement slightly skewed and somehow entirely right. Cale came down the hall and stood in the doorway. He took in the scene. His daughter in the wrong chair, Nora in the other wrong chair. The two of them side by side at the breakfast table as though the whole arrangement had long since been settled and only he was catching up. Nobody said anything. He got his coffee and sat in his chair and poured a second cup and set it in front of Nora without looking at her. Bea watched this. She picked up her spoon and set it down, precisely parallel to her bowl. The moment came on a Sunday, and Cale was not prepared for it. He had driven Bea into town for the morning service, as he did most weeks, and Nora had stayed behind to have the kitchen in order before they returned. It had been raining since before dawn, a cold, steady November rain, and the road home was slow. They got back later than intended. Bea had fallen asleep against his arm on the drive, and he carried her from the wagon into the house and set her down by the kitchen fire to warm up. He was pulling on his coat to go back out to the barn when Bea woke. She was disoriented for a moment, as children are, looking at the ceiling and then at the fire and then around the room. Then she looked toward the hallway. Nora had come to the doorway. She had heard the wagon and came to see if Bea needed anything, and she was standing there with her hair still pinned but a few strands loose from the morning's work, looking at Bea the way she looked at things she was trying not to want. Bea looked at her for a long moment. Then Bea said she had dreamed about Nora, that Nora was there for always, and that they had a dog. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain and the fire. Nora came in and knelt in front of Bea and tucked the blanket more firmly around her shoulders without saying anything. She smoothed Bea's hair back from her forehead the way a mother does, the way a person does when they have stopped pretending they do not want to. Cale stood at the door with his coat in his hands. He did not put it on. Bea's eyes were already going soft with sleep again, but she reached out and wrapped her fingers around Nora's wrist, just the way Eleanor used to hold on to something she wanted to keep close. She said it quietly, without drama, without asking anything at all. "You should stay." Nora did not answer. She stayed crouched there with Bea's small hand around her wrist and her face turned slightly away from the lamp. Cale set his coat over the back of the chair. He said Nora's name, quietly, across the room. She looked up at him. He told her the fence along the north section was going to need the same work as the east come spring, and that he could use someone who knew what to look for. It was not a declaration. He knew it was not a declaration. It was a rancher talking about a fence line. And nothing more, and also it was everything, and she knew it too. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at Bea, who had fallen fully asleep with her hand still loosely circled around Nora's wrist. She said she expected she could look at it. He nodded. He went to the stove and filled his coffee cup, and then filled a second one and set it on the table. At her place. The rain came down against the window. The fire settled. Bea slept. Nora stayed where she was a few minutes longer, and then, careful not to wake the child, she gently uncurled Bea's fingers from her wrist and laid the small hand down on the blanket. She stood up and crossed the kitchen and sat at her place at the table. Cale did not say anything else, and neither did she, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house. The weeks that followed did not look like much from the outside. There were long days and cold mornings and the ordinary difficulty of keeping a ranch going through the early part of winter. Dutch got his man to pull the wagon axle that had been giving trouble since October. Walter the beetle disappeared after the first real frost, which Bea received with a philosopher's equanimity and a short private ceremony near the fence post. The ranch cook was back on his feet. But on the first Thursday of December, he came to Cale and mentioned, without quite looking at him, that the men had been wondering whether there might be some occasion when the woman from the house might cook for them again. Not as a regular thing. Just when she was of a mind. Cale said he would ask. He asked. Nora looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup and said she would need a larger pot. He ordered one from the merchant in town, along with the winter flour and the lamp oil, and paid for it out of the ranch accounts without a second thought, the way a man pays for something that belongs. She cooked the second time on the second Friday of December. Cold enough that the ground had frozen hard and the autumn light was gone from the sky by 4 in the afternoon. She made the same meal as before, the clear deep broth with the onions and the slow-cooked beef, and added biscuits, and carried everything to the bunkhouse herself. B went with her. B carried the biscuits. The crew went quiet when they came in. Not the same silence as the first time. That first silence had been a surprise, the involuntary hush of men caught off guard by something their bodies recognized before their minds did. This silence was different. It was the silence of men who had been waiting without admitting they were waiting, and who were now simply glad. Nora set the pot down and stood at the end of the table. Dutch looked up from his bowl and said they were much obliged, the way a man speaks when the words are only a fraction of what he means. One by one down the table, the other hands said the same. Nora thanked them. B sat beside her and ate a biscuit and watched the room with those patient, long-focused eyes, so clearly at ease, so entirely at home, that more than one man looked at her, and then at Nora, and quietly looked away. They all understood. When supper was done and the pot was empty, B slipped her hand into Nora's as they walked back across the yard. The cold had come down properly now, the sky clear and hard, and the frost on the ground caught the last light and held it like something worth keeping. Cale was at the gate. He held it open and said nothing, and when B went past him into the house, he fell into step beside Nora, and they walked the path together in silence. At the kitchen door she handed him the empty pot. He took it. She went inside. He followed. The lamp was on the table and the fire was built, and B was already at her chair, setting the spoons down precisely. The kitchen held the three of them the way it had begun to hold things, easily, without question, as though it had always been arranged this way, and the only thing that had ever been missing was time.